Remarkable acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are gathered today. This is their land, never ceded, always sacred. And we pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the traditions, the culture and the hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across the nation. We acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the remarkable contribution they make to Australian life. And we would also like to acknowledge the advocates who have played a role in advancing the rights of people with disability, leading to address the inequalities faced by people with disability. They have paved the way for us. We carry a privilege and a responsibility because of that history. We are better together. When we think of what it takes to be a successful entrepreneur, we think of innovation, determination, and ability to adapt to change. It should come at no surprise then that there has and continues to be a growing wealth of talent in disabled entrepreneurs. But how can we do better to harness this largely untapped talent pool? In this episode, we speak with advocate and founder Charli Skinner, who's on a mission to empower young adults who are chronically ill and disabled to design a radically inclusive world around us. Charli shares her experience of acquiring a brain injury and how this exposed the stark reality of inaccessible workplaces, the hidden costs of disability, and also has taught her how we can do better to tap into the potential of disabled entrepreneurs. Hello, Charli. Thank you so much for joining me for this remarkable Insights conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
That's wonderful. Well, we start these conversations by asking our wonderful guests if they could do a visual description of themselves, because this is also going to be a video podcast. So if I could ask you to just describe what you look like in your surrounding, that would be wonderful.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. So yes, I'm Charli. I'm sitting here in my hallway on a boat that I live on, actually, which is lovely. But yeah, my hallway is a white hallway. I've got a couple of little photos hanging on the side. I am a white woman with blonde hair, blue eyes. I'm wearing dangly earrings that move about when I move my head. Yeah.
Wonderful. I'll also describe myself for everyone listening. I'm Viv. I have got very fair skin and blue eyes, and I've got long brown hair, and I always wear red lipstick just to make me feel a little more alive. And around me is my desk and a bookshelf right above my head because I love reading. I would love to just sort of start off, if we could just jump into as little or as much as you'd like to share about, your experience acquiring your disability sort of later in life and how that sort of positioned you into this chapter of your life professionally and personally.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's been quite the journey, and definitely is pretty much the sole reason I am here today is because of this kind of what's happened. So yeah, you're right. I acquired my chronic illness, which is essentially a disabling set of chronic illnesses, about just over 4 years ago now, actually. So it's not even that long into my adult life, but definitely at a time when you're sort of, it was in my late 20s. I was in a kind of position in my career where, thinking about what's next. I, pretty stable in my job, had built up a solid amount of skills and figured out, a little bit of the groove of where I was at. And I actually sustained a head injury, which was the catalyst for a whole series of events over the last 4 to 5 years, which essentially have left me with long-term health conditions that I live with now and have to manage, and I will be living with for the rest of my life. So it's been quite the process, in the sense that it was a really, really big shift in my life. I went from being someone who essentially didn't really think twice about things like getting up and going to work without kind of, all of the extra stuff. It's just, this is something I do in my day. Seeing friends in the evenings, just the everyday life things that we all sort of, essentially the term that always comes up is take for granted. But yeah, essentially that's as simple as it is. And so my entire kind of livelihood and stability went up in the air very quickly, dealing with it like an acute onset of health issues that turned chronic. And that is what has kind of a very long story short, led me to where I am today. Initially I was out of work, actually, so had to navigate through a situation of navigating things like how do you get paid sick leave, and you mentioned the disability price tag at the beginning, which is one of the biggest reasons that we started Soda, is that people who are chronically ill and disabled are often finding themselves, if you're born with a disability or chronic illness, you're spending most of or all of your life dealing with these types of access challenges and financial stability challenges. But there's equally, if you acquire a disability through your lifetime, there's quite a stark difference between one day to the next and what your capability and ability to sustain yourself is. So that's part of the reason why also I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about Soda and what we're doing, but the organisation that I have founded now partly comes from that place of looking for me being that individual who was looking for all of this type of support, and support in accessing things like work, accessing the outdoors, accessing even just social environments with my friends, accessing healthcare, all that kind of stuff that I basically spent, years, and still do spend years trying to navigate my way through and advocate my way through. And then the other side of it is the flip side of, financial stability, which is a huge challenge for people who are chronically ill and disabled. And the price tag, I think it was some statistics showed that it's something like on average more than £500 a month. For a disabled person to live with the extra accommodations that they need to navigate through society. So even just that is astounding, and needs something done about it. So.
Yeah, and you've sort of touched, even explaining that you live in a boat, and this sort of sense of adventure that just comes, you can see it in your personality just over a Zoom call. But this idea of acquiring your disability, and I believe you've shared it in other articles where it was an incident that was sort of just an everyday situation. Could you sort of speak to exactly, if you don't mind?
Actually, yeah, I was at home, which is, and as you say, I'm an adventurous person. I do all sorts of fun and what some people might call silly things as well when it comes to doing like extreme sports and that kind of stuff. So I actually, funnily enough, especially sustaining a head injury, people just assume when you're someone who's active and busy and about and doing some it's crazy things here and there that it would have been something quite extreme. But I just when I hit my head, I was at home in the bathroom, fell over, just a very everyday situation. And I think one of the biggest things I learned from actually that incident, firstly, I knew something was definitely absolutely wrong. So I ended up in hospital with getting, brain scans and all that kind of thing to figure out what was up, and getting to the bottom of what deficiencies I had in like my kind of brain function, which was actually quite a lot at the time, it turned out. But it's one of those things that people just aren't aware actually of how significantly something like a head injury can affect your whole life, and how it can actually affect your bodily state, of course, obviously your mental state, and how they're all so significantly interlinked. And it's such a simple, what kind of boring accident turns into a whole series of events. So,
and it sort of starts this conversation about this idea of invisible disabilities, and it sort of sounds like as soon as the incident happened, you had to start advocating just for yourself to be heard. And can you sort of speak to that sense of being issues sort of being ignored because perhaps they weren't exactly physical, and how that sort of continued in your journey?
The very nature of an invisible disability is one that you can't see it, and so the assumption very much by people around, and you think when I say people around, I might just mean people who might not understand, but actually people who are dealing with people with health issues every single day, including doctors. I think there's a sort of societal view that if something's invisible, it doesn't mean it has a physical manifestation. When in reality, I don't even know what the percentage of, but most of our body is inside. So you don't know what's going on in there. You can't tell, like, what someone's heart's doing, what someone's brain's doing, what someone's whatever is doing just by looking at them. And actually, a lot of what may seem initially as just a physical disability also have a lot of invisible manifestations that affect the way someone can just navigate the whole world around them and what their access issues are. And advocating for myself, it started from even just the moment of when you're sort of internally thinking something's wrong here. I need to even just advocate for myself to myself, that let alone thinking about other people that you need to go and talk to and seek help from. Even just, I think, a big problem in our sort of ableist is the way to describe it, but our ableist world is that we are brought up to not think, oh gosh, I should seek help when I'm ill, or I'm, trying, especially in our Western society, is very individualist. It's very it's very, look after yourself and then figure it out. And so, at first you've got to convince yourself, and then you've got to convince a doctor, and then you've got to convince an employer, and then your friends and your family. And I use the word convince because while, of course, we shouldn't have to convince anyone, that is the bottom, the kind of long and short of advocating for yourself is essentially that you are having to push for your rights, what you need, and to try and actually, initially, when you are first getting ill, you don't even know what's wrong with you. So you really are relying on an external, help like doctors to get you where you need to be, to find out what your conditions are, and then to be able to actually manage those things yourself and move, be able to kind of move forward with your life in a way that is manageable. So advocacy is huge.
Yeah, and as you navigated that journey of advocating for yourself and advocating internally and then throughout the medical system, did your relationship with technology change because you weren't getting that support from the systems?
Yeah. Definitely. And tech is actually a really interesting one, because it's something that initially, for me as an individual, I found really inaccessible because of my brain issues. And because something that I relied on, like my phone or my computer screen, became inaccessible to me because of visual sort of interference and noise interference and those kinds of things, that my brain just, was essentially got to a place of finding it really difficult to process those kinds of things. So initially I struggled with that because I didn't know how to navigate tech in an accessible way. I only knew how to navigate tech in the way that I was used to, for example, texting on WhatsApp or a FaceTime video call. So those kinds of things that I was really used to, I tried to continue to do, and I tried to use tech to keep me connected because I was so isolated, but I wasn't using it in a way that worked for me because I didn't know what was available to me from a tech point of view that would make my life a lot easier. So even now, even though now I can easily go on a FaceTime or video call, I mean, I'm on a video call right now, I now always use dictation on my phone to write out like text messages and those kinds of things. That's something that I didn't actually, it's almost mind blowing to think that such a simple tool before I didn't use or rely on, and how transformative that was for me, like a small simple tool like that. And then of course, like as you go along, the more years you spend and the more tips you get from people about different sort of tech things that you can use to facilitate the way you access, people on the other side of whatever that tech thing is, was one huge thing around, not being socially isolated. But another area that tech was huge and still is huge in managing health stuff is the way that it's transformed the way that work is done and the way that the healthcare system's delivered, because we are able now to do things more remotely, and even, for example, a hospital appointment can if you need it to be, can be done remotely these days. And when you when you need physical in-person stuff, you go and you do that, and you prioritize that. But it's the world of tech has opened up access to some really core things that people with invisible disabilities and generally people with chronic illness and disabilities should have had access to for years. So it's brilliant that there's so much more I need to learn about different accessible tech tools, I'm sure. But
Yeah, and I suppose that sort of leads to this idea of the return to life journey that you speak about, and I wonder specifically for things like brain injury or chronic illness or invisible illnesses, it, where is the education piece on supporting people of this return to life process, and how tech can really help help support that journey, or are we still at a point where you just have to sort of learn as you go? And
I think from my personal experience, it very much learn as you go. I think tech is a huge part of. I spoke to kind of social isolation. I think that it's the social isolation, the kind of convening element of tech is super important in that space, particularly in the chronic illness space, and particularly because we are still in a space where it's quite learn as you go. I found, for example, when I first tried to access healthcare and any employment support, because those were the two most important things to me to figure out. Because if you don't have healthcare and employment, your illness is getting less manageable, and your financial stability is at risk. And those two things are enough to send someone far enough in a direction where they need even more support. So when I first went to seek that help, I wasn't really given tools. Given a few leaflets here and there to firstly navigate my symptoms. Like, that's one thing in itself, is you've got this whole new set of symptoms that your body's doing that you don't understand, and you don't know how to actually how to deal with them, how to make them better, there are so many things to learn about a set of symptoms that you experience, and there isn't a lot out there in terms of information, and tech is something that can enable that. So there's one side of things around information and resources and understanding what you're actually dealing with, rather than being given a leaflet that you can't read, for example, especially from someone with a brain injury and all the other things going on. And then the other side, is that community side, and where I initially went to seek this type of information were places like social media. I went and literally just looked for hashtags or people who were sharing about the conditions that the doctors thought I was dealing with, and that's how I started, was on Instagram, finding out information, and I'd go on the NHS website and do some research, the UK National Health Service website. But again, that was nothing in comparison to hearing from someone else who was going through it, what their symptoms were, how they dealt with it, a little bit of advice on how to deal with an access issue, how to speak to your employer, all of that kind of stuff. And that's where also, again, this the organization that I've co-founded with my colleagues has come from. Like, we want to create that kind of space for people who are going to a doctor's, dealing with their initial journey and not really getting enough resource that they should, and enable that through a kind of tech and community type platform. I think those things are unbelievably valuable.
And before we dive into the world of soda, I wonder, I'm still learning about this concept of access intimacy, and is what you've just spoken about in wanting employers and the medical or the health system to understand your access needs before you even have to raise them. Is that sort of what access intimacy is about? Or could you explain that concept to people who don't know what it is?
Yeah, I think it's a really good example of access intimacy. Yeah, I think access intimacy is a phrase that's coined by Mia Mingus, who is a absolutely brilliant disability activist, disability justice activist, and she does a lot of work in the space of access-centered work. So access intimacy is, you gave a good example of it. For example, when you go to an employer, they've already done some research, and they're coming to you with, we've tried to understand your condition. We've taken also what you have, what you've put out there already and what you told us already, and we have proactively tried to address your access issues. It's the same as, a friend, when they ask you to hang out in the evening, can we check that the venue is okay in terms of, is there going to be loud live music there, was something that I would consider, that I would stop me from going into a venue. It wouldn't be that I couldn't, for example, access the table itself, because I could walk up to the table, but if I sat down at the table and I couldn't hear what my friend was saying, and that would make my brain, go into a process of shutdown, then that's not accessible for me. And the fact that a friend had addressed my access needs proactively is another example of how access intimacy can be, as a concept, and it essentially recognizes that there is a lot around us that allies can do to support our access needs, and that when they're doing that, they're recognizing that that's allowing us to be more of to live our lives more fully, and for us to be more of our full person without having to I won't go back to that sort of explaining yourself and advocating for yourself concept, which basically it kind of recognizes that everyone who's chronically ill and disabled is very tired of having to do that for themselves. So when you've got allies around you supporting you with access intimacy, then that's the dream.
And I wonder if it makes sense to say access intimacy and tech sort of go. There's a really beautiful intersection there, in that we can all sort of practice this notion of access intimacy by having this technology on standby and really addressing people and listening to them and seeing them and coming to the table and coming to the meetings with these tools, before even needing to ask the people needing to ask for them. And have you had examples of that happening more as you've raised your profile as an advocate?
Definitely. I think there are a few things that have changed the way that this stuff is provided. One of them is one of the few sort of negatives of the COVID situation and the pandemic is that people are just more used to using tech as a tool to create access for everyone. And I think that's another good example of how access needs for one group can often, when they're addressed, can often support every single person on the planet in the sense that something that I might use because of my disability or chronic illness is also going to help someone who doesn't have a chronic illness or disability when, for instance, you're trying to organize stuff like things like meetings or events or anything like that. The kind of transition towards it being a bare minimum and a compliance type tool when it comes to accessibility being integrated into tech is absolutely vital. And we had a really interesting conversation with someone at Microsoft actually the other week who was talking about how compliance now is just, we don't even go out to people to ask, is this okay, because it is the bare minimum. Then we're going out to people who have access issues to ask, what are the extra things you want that are going to take this to another level, that are going to take the bottom line of compliance that has all these add-ons that allow someone to navigate a meeting or whatever it might be, to the next level, to enable them to actually really contribute in their best way possible, for example. So yeah.
And this idea of we say how disability drives innovation, but this big conversation of how people with lived experience of disability have this innate sort of ability to be creative thinkers and to be problem solvers and to be these really important people to have at a table when we're talking about design and innovation. And I think you've spoken about this conversation about really needing to support those creatives and those people by also taking into account the additional costs of living that have to be factored into being a disabled entrepreneur. And can you sort of speak to that in your experience of regaining work and navigating your life in a professional sense and having to advocate for people just being aware of the additional costs that you're harboring per month?
Yeah. It's a really difficult one because when it comes to the work environment, I talked about financial stability. So having solid work is some people. It's really important to acknowledge that there are many people who are chronically ill and disabled who actually can't work because of their chronic illness and disability. So actually, even just before I talk about the world of work and those of us who do have privilege to access work, there is a large swathe of the population who can't access work, and there are a lot of issues. That's a whole other topic of discussion around how we support people who don't have the freedom to access financial stability that way, through things like support programs and benefits and those types of things. But when it comes to the world of work and I think there's something around a kind of middle group of enabling people who have faced barriers to work before, who actually probably do have the ability to work but haven't been given the tools to do it. That there's a really important middle group of people who, as you say, disabled people are innovators. I almost even want to call them hustlers, because they literally have to hustle their way through lives. They're hustling their way through creating alternative solutions because they're not being offered them. So, disabled people are the people who are at the forefront of working, multiple different interesting jobs, not doing 9 to 5s. Everyone talks about, the 9 to 5 working for the man, it's awful. Meanwhile, disabled people have realized that years ago and are hustling their way through their lives. So there's a lot to learn from us hustlers, I think. But there really is this really important space around enabling people into those environments, and for example, recognizing that remote work actually is something that people can do productively. Tech can enable working processes as well. Employers can use tools to be able to stay in contact with their employees in a much more facilitated way these days as well. And then I think there's, for me, I can use myself as a good example of someone who was on that middling ground and has managed to establish a place of balance with my work. It is a constant work in progress, but I actually made a shift from a really big shift, and it was a difficult decision to make, from going from working for a 9 to 5 job to saying, no, I actually need to work for myself, because the only way that I will be able to create the access environment that works for me is if I work for myself. And that in itself is obviously an amazing thing to be able to do, and to be able to I managed to get myself to a position where I could financially sustain myself and set up the business. But it's also a huge negative, because the fact that I was driven out of work because I couldn't access work, and essentially actually was left with no other choice than to start my own thing, in itself is a problem. So we need to create the environments for people to be able to choose whether they want to do something that is the equivalent of the 9 to 5, or a part-time role, or working for themselves, or working as a freelancer, and being able to explore all those models with all the tools that are available to them, without being forced to just assumed that it's not possible for them to work.
And was that a decision you had to make after really frank conversations where you just laid out your ask and people just said, we can't facilitate that?
Yeah, I went through a very prolonged process of negotiation of accommodations for my working environment at the time. And to the extent that I had, specialist doctors on the phone with my employers saying, these are the types of things that Charli needs. And a lot of those things were implemented, but part of the issue is this, like you were talking about earlier, this access intimacy issue, is that I was also navigating new ground. I didn't quite know what could be available to me and what might make my life a lot easier. So I advocated for accommodations that I had sort of tried and tested that worked, but there were probably also others that I've now, in a way, subconsciously just integrated into the way I work and the way I live my life, that at the time probably would have helped. But again, I didn't know that I needed to advocate for those things, because I didn't have someone telling me X, Y, Z is probably really helpful for you. And to be honest, the reality really of it is that, especially in the pre-COVID world, which was when I was dealing with this, the option of remote work was just wasn't an option. And that's essentially what ended up driving me out, because I couldn't go into an office environment with all this extra input going on, and the exhaustion and fatigue that's caused by, traveling in every day and that kind of thing. And now actually the irony is I have, managed to get to a point of management that I am able to travel into various work locations when I need to. So it just takes time and the right accommodations. For me as an individual. Yeah.
Yeah, it it's 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 such a it makes you sort of hurt as well as just feel super empowered that you were able to come out of that, and look back at it and sort of say, in some ways, I told you so, to these people that just kept saying no. And it's a shame that it took COVID for that to be, for the light bulb to really, sort of switch on for the world at large about remote working and about accessibility and accommodations. But is it, when you look at the change that you've experienced, becoming your own boss, and it, I suppose I'll restart that question. Is soda your solution to this? Are you looking? Have you created, this brilliant organisation as a way to solve this problem of constantly being told no by people when it comes to accommodations and design? So, two questions: is soda your solution, and what is soda?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I would say soda is definitely our solution. It has been born of this combination of my personal experience with a lot of other people who we have spoken to, who've also experienced many of the same, if not a lot worse things than I have. So it's born of a recognition that there is a whole group of people in our society who really want to reach their potential, who are innovative, who have got that hustle, and who want to make stuff happen but aren't being given the tools to do it. And I'll describe what soda is, because that will help put it in place. It all is essentially that soda is an organization that we're building a community of young people with chronic illness and disability. So one of those people would be someone like me, where we recognize that there's a group, and particularly, again, born of this personal experience and other young people in my community, that we're working with 18 to 35-year-olds, recognizing that there's a little bit of a gap, particularly in healthcare, and also just a kind of societal, I think, assumption that when you're of that sort of age, it's your prime time and you're good to go, especially when it's an invisible illness, because the classical sort of term of you're too young to be ill type of thing is a huge issue. So we've recognized that there's a group of people who are navigating these types of issues, and so we have this community of people that we're brought together who the ambition is that they can firstly help support one another, and looking at the examples that I raised earlier around these types of communities don't really exist apart from in particular disease groups. There are a lot of, if you've got a particular condition, there are communities that are there for you. But there aren't necessarily communities that are based around access and around access needs, which often tend to be universal, even if you have completely different conditions. So one of the aims of SODA is to build this community of support of other people, other people like me who I can identify with, who can help point me to resources, give me advice, those types of things, if I'm also a member of the community. And then the other kind of, I guess the really vital thing for us is we want to actually also make that change. So you were referring to that earlier, is, we want organizations to be giving people access, and we want accommodations to be the bottom line, and we want everything to be above and beyond. And so we want to use our community expertise to go to organizations, to work with them to make their services more accessible. So for example, when you're talking about things like the healthcare system, employers who are going through processes of employment or who are dealing with current employees who might be experiencing access or accommodation issues, public spaces, restaurants, service type areas like that. And then there's a whole other space around products and accessible product, and that's where tech also comes into the space, I think, of a service and a product. But there's a lot going on these days around making sure tech is accessible and AAA and all those kinds of things. So we also, working in that type of space as well, getting our community to provide their expert insight on how products and services can be more accessible. So yeah, I know if this had been available to me when I was first, if someone had said, "Oh, there's this thing called Soda," I would have been like, "Oh yeah, sign me up." So that's our ambition. I mean, we've also got a lot of longer term plans for exciting things for community members. But at the moment, we're just growing the community. So yeah.
And what does the community look like? From how diverse?
It's a big mixture, actually. So we're doing something really exciting over the next 3 months. We're bringing together our community members to actually co-design what the community should look like. We have been we're pretty early days. We were only born in February this year, so we're still, even in our first year of operation. And we've been doing some projects with clients, and particularly in the health space. But what we want to do is also projects with our community. So we're actually paying our community members to talk about, what are the types of features that they want to something like this to look like. And when we were doing that, we were, looking at the diversity of the community itself. And there's a large invisible disability representation. I think especially because that's kind of the kind of area that Soda's pitched in is more in that space, and I think more people are we have a bit more kind of network in that space. We've got a really really interesting balance of ethnicities, gender. Next week we've got people from mainly the UK actually working with us, because we first initially want to sort of start in the UK market, but we also have people from all over the world who've joined us online. So it's quite amazing to see the traction, and even just things like it's rare that these types of paid opportunities are available for people to talk about their personal experience. It's often at the end of we've got a product, we want you to test it. And that can be quite a transactional interaction. So we're quite excited about bringing this group of people who have just, a vast array of different experiences, but a lot of also common experiences that we're going to be exploring over the next 3 months to find out what the community actually wants, firstly, but also where are the kind of key issues that they really want us to focus on first, like what thematic issues are affecting them the most in their lives. And if, for example, tech might be one of them. And we want to go and explore that if that's what people identify.
And since the start of Soda, and even in your work with your own personal advocacy, what have you been able to shake up? What change have you seen happen as a result of your work?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the areas I often see change in and really core response in is when we go and speak about our experience, which is why I want people to be able to speak about their experience, because I know for example, whenever I go to a conference or something like that and speak about this, this intervention as a result of a personal story, and particularly actually also the experience of co-founding with two colleagues. So I should mention Alex and Ollie, who are absolutely brilliant. Alex and Ollie and I, we met last year on our the fellowship program, which was all around creating business for social impact, and so that's how we connected. So we've explored, where do we find the most change happening in our work together over the last couple of years. And one area is definitely, going and being able to actually have the floor and speak about like what is a personal experience and how people really identify with that. So I think that's really important, is proliferating the message is so vital, and around personal experience, because people tend to, even if they can't relate because of their own experience, they do relate to it and they empathize. So that's one area that makes a huge change. We the three of us, Ollie, Alex, and I have been working majority of the last year in the public health service space. We also kind of operate in a health kind of consulting type role in health innovation projects. And we have found the most change that we've been able to make has been when we are consulting on the ground with communities. So we're currently working on a project with the NHS actually to design a community healthcare fund, where we're consulting with people who are at the highest risk of health inequalities at a grassroots level, to actually design exactly what they want the fund to address. And again, it's another example of that traction of it's so vital to involve this personal experience in order for something to be relevant and appropriate. Really the most difference is made when we are enabled to do that. I think it's, and again, that it just continues to point towards the ambitions of why Soda wants to do what we're doing. We need to have the voices at the center of designing these things. People actually also listen higher up when you say, like, this was designed by the very people that are going to benefit from it. It's a huge selling point in a way.
And even in your personal experience, when you went through the health system right at the beginning, or quite quickly after your accident, was there ever a point where you were given an opportunity to connect with someone and have that facilitation of talking to someone that had been through a similar experience?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I was never given that by anyone externally. I'm now aware that there are organizations out there that, particularly I pointed earlier to organizations that support particular chronic illnesses or particular diseases or particular disabilities. There's a lot of stuff out there like that, and often those are the ones that you get if you do get connected to anything by a healthcare professional or an employer or a family friend or a member, whoever it might be. It normally tends to be in that space, because people really medicalize illness, which is obviously understandable to some extent, in the sense that when you're in a medical setting and someone giving you support of in that clinical sense is really important. But what's not really there is that connection with someone who's, like, you talked about the return to life. Like, I want to talk to someone about my return to life. Where's that person? And that wasn't offered, no. So, that really, I went and found that, and I ended up with, a group of online friends, half of whom I've never even met, but who are some of my close, really close friends now. So. And then others I haven't. It's been absolutely brilliant, like meeting these people who you're like been, who you've gone through this wild journey with.
And have some of those friendships transferred over to the Soda community?
Yeah, they have actually. We the thing again. I go back to the hustler point of view. It's absolutely amazing what people are doing online, and one of my brilliant friends is Ananya. Actually, she's a online, and she's an illustrator. She does a lot of disabled advocacy work, and she does mainly illustration around campaigns to highlight the disabled experience and fight for disability justice. And we met online. We both had the exact same accident at nearly the exact same time 4 and a bit years ago. And it started like that, and then we both went on a journey of not being, both working for a 9-to-5 job, both dealing with losing employment, both being like, what do we do now? And now she's doing this brilliant, illustration work. I'm working on Soda. We like bounce off each other, talk about ideas. There are people who are members of the community who who I've just been friends with for a while, who spread the word, and then friends of theirs, and it just proliferates. Because I think it's just so needed.
Yeah, and it's kind of, we talk a lot about this relationship between I can never say the word. I work in this space. Entrepreneurship. Whatever the word. And disability. And you've said it just then, it was sort of this natural progression for you in a way. As soon as you started to navigate working with a disability, it just sort of ends up you and in this place where you have this hustle about you and this drive to say, I'm just going to make it work for me, which goes hand in hand with this idea of the startup space, is people designing things that didn't exist before, and that's what you've done. And I think it is baffling that intersection isn't celebrated and really amplified more. And with Soda, do you have much? Do you have much of a relationship with the startup space? Or are you working more with sort of bigger companies? Like what is the? Where do you want to make noise in both? I suppose I'm saying.
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, I think making noise everywhere is the goal, but
I'll help.
I want to make noise everywhere. Yeah, literally everywhere. Startup, massive organizations. Like we need to go in and change it all from the inside. But it's interesting you ask about the startup space, because the startup space is, as well as being a space of exciting new ideas and innovation, of course, and a highly creative space. It's also a space that is interested and I think, as far as my experience has been in the space, is interested and wants to make social impact as well. And I think there's a recognition that a startup organization can, because you can pivot and you can be agile and aligned to what your needs are, but also what's going on around you much more easily than a big organization can that has all of its systems entrenched. There's a lot of change that can be made, not only because startups are trying to do that already, but also because you can get in. And I've had some really interesting conversations with your colleagues at Remarkable around how you can really, if you get in early enough to make that change and get the voices heard at the beginning around how something can be designed in the startup world, then you are golden, because you're already thinking ahead of the curve. Your organization may end up a $1 billion company, and it may end up being one of those massive ones with a huge system one day. But if you've integrated that process from the start of listening to voices of the people who are going to be using your product or your service or whatever it is, then that's a really valuable space for us to be working in. So we're definitely, we've got one client space, which is this public service space, which is a space which is, there's always going to be work to be done there. It's a never-ending space of work in the healthcare system and employment systems and social care systems, and we love working in that space because there's a lot of traction. There's constantly more to be done. But we're also, actually one of our kind of next ambitions is to find an organization that is already already bought onto the idea, especially of inclusion and diversity, that also considers disability, because one of the biggest issues of the kind of diversity and inclusion movement is that it often forgets that there are other really important intersections like disability. We want, finding organizations that are to some extent already bought on but don't know how to actually implement. And that's where we want to get in and make that change. Then once you've kind of proven yourself in that space, I think it's a lot easier to then go into the big dogs. And because you've got to think, at that point, you're thinking about changing people's minds. And ways there are some absolutely brilliant big organizations who are already doing really very, very good work, but there's a lot more work to be done in the big system. So yeah.
And I think there's also a conversation that needs to be had that when we talk about the startup space, there is this sort of hustle culture that's encouraged, and it's I think historically that hasn't been a very balanced approach, and it's been very much work non-stop, never stop thinking about it, and really work yourself to the ground. And that I refuse to encourage that, because I think especially in this space we have to be mindful of the fact that if we're not encouraging balance and health first, then we're sort of backpedaling, because invisible illness, mental health conditions, invisible disabilities, all of this chronic illnesses rely on this real, and disabilities in general, but also just the human condition relies on prioritizing your health and your happiness first and foremost. And I think that is sort of critical to the next wave of startups that I hope that we can start encouraging. And how does that lend itself to your experience as you've navigated having your own, building soda? Can you speak to that?
It's absolutely central to it. And Alex, Ollie and I are constantly going through this process of iteration of ways of working, because the company's not going to survive if the co-founders aren't looking after themselves. And particularly if we're building a business around one of us has chronic illness that is disabling it, it sends me off into a crash every so often and I have to stop working. That's literally just how it is. And it to some extent will always be like that. Some stages of life it's going to be worse, and other stages it's going to be more manageable. Alex deals with neurodiversity as well. So there's access issues around neurodiversity that are really important for us to implement in the way that we work on a daily basis. And Ollie has childcare responsibilities. Like, these are the types of things that are, again, it's an access issue. We're not talking about chronic illness or disability, but we're talking about access still, and the types of things that benefit me as someone who's chronically ill to make sure that my energy is saved, like my working hours being quite flexible. I work part-time, I don't work full-time, and I probably will never work full-time again. That is partly because of my illness, but it's also because actually I've made the proactive choice to live, a more balanced life, knowing that my business is going to, probably benefit from it than suffer. And it's a really important thing around the ethos of the way we want to also grow Soda. A big principle of what we want to do when we grow is prioritize hiring disabled people, recognizing that disabled people are, 15% of the population, and the access to work is a huge problem. The statistics are off the charts. I think it's something like 49% of working age adults feel excluded from society, and that's like everything in society, because of their impairment or disability, that's astounding. It doesn't surprise me at all, but it's also astounding. So we really want to have that at the center of our ethos around how we work and how we hire people. It's going to be centrally disabled people as we expand. And then also we've learned from some really interesting organizations. There's an organization called Even Break in the UK, which supports disabled people into work. And they actually hire people on the basis of their skill rather than writing up a job description when they hire people, recognizing that classical way of writing a job description tries to fit someone into a box that no one fits into that box. And it doesn't recognize that us as humans have not just the skills of a job description, but also other multifaceted skills that we want to practice in our workplace and that we might not even know we have yet. But if we get given the space to explore them, again, we're only ever going to be more innovative and all those kinds of things. So, learning from organizations like that, who I just love the idea of, like, you interview someone and you find out about them rather than saying, can you fit into our box of, here's a comms role. Can you do all these things? Tick, 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 tick. That's not what we'd be looking for. And I guess the last thing I want to say around this sort of area of, access, particularly in the startup space and founding space, is that you're right, it's not a very accessible space. The hustle culture it comes with its fun kind of like, oh, I love the idea of being a hustler, but it also, which we want the good parts of being a hustler, but we don't want the bad parts of being a hustler, because they don't work for us. Even just things like access to funding and the type of accelerator programs that actually aren't designed to have a curriculum or a support structure or mentor structure that is accessible. It might be full-time, for example. Like, that is not going to be accessible for many disabled people. Funding opportunities might have specific deadlines that aren't flexible. Again, that might not be accessible to someone who may be dealing with an acute or chronic health issue at that moment. And building in mechanisms that allow people to navigate things like accelerator programs or funding programs in the startup space. And then also even just to get hired into a startup to see if they like the taste of the experience, and then maybe they want to launch off and do their own thing. Those kinds of mechanisms are vital for getting all of these amazing brains into a fun and creative employment space.
It's brilliant. And what I love is I've just taken away some really good notes to go back to the Remarkable team.
Excellent.
And I think we're so, I'll always be very transparent about the fact that we aren't perfect, and this commitment to creating an accessible and inclusive program that supports driving the disability tech space. There's an obligation and a real honor to be accountable, to say we don't get it right, and whatever we can do to constantly improve is what we will do. And I think that's sort of the exciting thing about these sort of conversations that are ever flowing, and also just an inclusive conversation. It's so lovely to be able to talk to someone that has this experience and this excitement and zest for the space. And I'd like to say thank you. uh, we tend to finish these conversations with asking brilliant guests to share a remarkable insight. And that sort of stands for some sort of insight into your own experience that you would like to share, or a piece of advice moving forward for people looking at doing co-design, working with people like Soda. So I'll pass the mic to you for you to share whatever insight you feel you would like to.
I feel like I feel like there's a kind of community insight and a personal insight. I think that my nugget of insight around my experience with this community is that the tiniest thing around listening to someone can make the biggest difference to the way that individual feels acknowledged and recognized and empowered in a community. And that's not a very kind of businessy piece of insight, but it is vital to the way that, for example, our business is going to work, because we want people who don't get listened to be listened to. And I know what it feels like to have even just one person in your, even in one person in 4 years who says, I understand what you're going through and we're going to do something about it. Hearing those words or something to that effect is enough to give someone the motivation to want to be involved in a change process and provide their expert insight. And we really need to see people as experts, and I think that's my piece of insight when it comes to anything like co-design. People with lived experience are experts, and that's how we need to see them. It's all very well having lots of research and academia out there that talks about, chronic illness and disabled experience, but the people who are going through it really know. So yeah, we need to listen to them. That's my piece of insight. And actually, you're so right about we've got to just keep trying, because none of us are ever always going to get it right. So let's just keep trying.
You're wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been such a pleasure and honor to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I've loved it. Really enjoyed it.